So again, this last script is available from that package websites through the GitHub repo. And I'll be doing something similar as I did for the behavioral state estimation, but just comparing space use across methods here. All right. And we should have used all these packages previously. I'm actually going to restart my R session now that I'm running a new script. Wait for these to load. And like I did for the other comparison, I'm reading in these R data files that saved these objects that I exported previously. And I'm also going to read in the tracks themselves to include with those estimated contours. So to do some initial data wrangling for each of these model results or estimated results, going to set these up for the minimum convex polygons, as well as the different kernel density estimates, and then the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model we just ran. And now to load in the Brazil layer. Now we're going to combine all of these different contours together from each of the different methods into a single data frame called ud.all, and then create a map or a facet plot showing these. Zoom in on this. Okay, so the left column is the 50% contour, and the right column is the 95% contour. And each of the rows is a different ID, and the colors indicates the different methods. So red is the dynamic Brownian bridge model. Blue is the plug-in method for kernel density estimation. Green is the reference bandwidth method for kernel density estimation. And gold is the 95% minimum convex polygon. So we're not going to see a minimum convex polygon for the 50% contour. But the first thing that jumps out, if we look at these 50% isoplets, this first column on the left here across individuals, is that the reference bandwidth. So the green contours are the largest and appear to be way overestimating space use here across individuals, with potentially the exception of the 2 resident individuals. By comparison, the plug-in method is much smaller, but is still slightly larger in these core areas of the 50% isoplets compared to the dynamic Brownian bridge movement models in red. If we look at the 95% contours, we see that it actually appears that the total area estimated by the minimum convex polygon is probably even smaller than the kernel density method with the reference bandwidth. However, like the kernel density estimate with the reference bandwidth, a lot of the area is not actually used by the turtle within that polygon. So it's not really a better metric necessarily. The total area it's estimating is just smaller. But we do see that again, the plug-in method for kernel density estimation is probably more realistic, at least by comparison to the minimum convex polygon and the reference bandwidth method for kernel density estimation. And the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model is providing or estimating the smallest amount of space use compared to the other methods. So if we zoom in on some of these resident individuals to see what's actually happening there. So again, the columns are the 50% and 95% contours, and the rows here are those 2 resident individual IDs, and the color codes remain the same. And it actually appears that there's not a ton of differences here, at least from a biological interpretation standpoint. So For this top row, looking at this one individual, we see for the 50% contour, the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model is actually producing a larger estimate of space use compared to both estimates of kernel density estimation. And then when looking at the 95% contour for that same individual to the right on that row, the reference bandwidth does appear to be estimating a larger contour, a larger space that was used, although not much larger than any of the other methods, and that's even including the minimum convex polygon. So for this particular example, for this particular individual, given the spread of the points, the way that they're clustered, the sample size, these methods are all actually comparable, but for like general guidelines, that doesn't necessarily mean I recommend using any of these different methods to estimate space use. There are some more slight differences here for this second resident individual in the bottom row, where the area actually estimated as a core area actually differs slightly for this 50% contour, where the reference method estimates an area that's kind of shifted to the right compared to the plug-in method in blue. And the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model actually kind of encompasses both of them. Whereas for this 95% contour, the plug-in method's actually identifying some of these ends of these spiked movements as part of the 95% contour, which doesn't quite make sense. It has some other holes or other gaps here, which may not really be particularly helpful. Whereas all the other three methods provide similar estimates of this, essentially this ellipse around that space being used. So just showing that there is a lot of nuance that goes into kind of exploring these methods for different data sets. So just because you would potentially maybe expect that the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model, based on what I've said so far, would it be expected to provide the best estimates in at least all the scenarios we've covered? That's not always the case. But across all individuals, including these, it may provide better estimates compared to things such as the kernel density estimation with reference bandwidth or minimum convex polygon. Now, if we look at the areas estimated by each method, and we're also going to account for whether they were resident or migratory, since that'll impact some of what we're estimating here. So we have area in kilometers squared on the y-axis, and then the level, so the contour, the 50% or 95% isopleth on the x-axis, and then the colors are denoting the method used. So the dynamic Brownian bridge model is the warmest color, the minimum convex polygon is the coolest color. And for the 50% contour, the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model and plug-in method for kernel density estimation seem to perform comparably, at least in terms of how much area it's estimating. And same goes for the 95% contour. They're very similar, they're very small. Whereas for the reference bandwidth of the kernel density estimates, this is quite larger by comparison. And then when we look at the 95% contour, this is actually quite large for the reference bandwidth method that's used for kernel density estimation compared to any of the other methods, and that's even including the minimum convex polygon. So again, we're kind of highlighting that in general, I would tend to avoid using the reference bandwidth if you're doing kernel density estimation, and in general, shouldn't be using minimum convex polygons. And if we look and account for the movement strategy, so whether they're resident versus migratory in this case, since we did notice that there were some differences. For the migratory individuals, it does appear that there are, again, large discrepancies in these 95% contours, where the dynamic Brownian bridge movement model and the plug-in method for kernel density estimation are quite small by comparison to the reference plug-in method or the reference bandwidth method for kernel density estimation and the minimum convex polygon. But for the residents, the two resident individuals, there's essentially no difference, at least in the area that was estimated that it's using. So this may be a particular instance where it may not be as important which of these methods is ultimately used if this is the sample size and the movement pattern that's being exhibited. And particularly for resident individuals, comparing the methods for each contour level, we actually see that the dynamic Brownian bridge movement models produce a larger estimate of space use compared to kernel density estimation at the 50% isopleth. And it's relatively mixed across the 95% isopleth or contour, where the plug-in method and the minimum convex polygon on average produce smaller areas. But this is on a scale from 1 to 3 kilometers. So this may not be that much of a difference overall, really. And that is it for this comparison. So with that, unless anyone has any objections, I will move on to the take-home slides that compare these methods. And that should go pretty quickly. And then that'll be it. And we can break for lunch, and that'll be the end of the workshop.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I know Fernando de Noronha already has a marine protected area around it. I'm wondering how difficult it would be to compare that to these home ranges you have for the residents around the island.
I guess it depends on what you mean by compare. Do you mean overlap? Do you mean what's the like?
Yeah, put them on the same plotting surface as a polygon or as a map or whatever.
So it would be easy to do. So one thing I'm not doing in this workshop that I think people would be interested in, that I think I mentioned on these slides, is estimating overlap. So overlap, particularly among like individuals that you tag. So like how much space is overlapping between different tagged individuals that share a region. But the same goes for, comparing it to a protected area. So how much of this protected area is this individual actually using? And essentially, since these utilization distributions are probability densities, you can say 95% or like 72% of the area used falls within this polygon, essentially, of this protected area. So you can make those claims essentially when you have a probability density surface like a utilization distribution, unlike the minimum convex polygons where it's just the area that's overlapping with no idea of the intensity of use. But yeah, it would be pretty easy to do. And there's a variety of different methods out there if you're at least comparing different types of overlap, especially when you're looking at density surfaces or volumes. So yeah, there's a lot out there regarding overlap stuff.
I just sent a PDF of a manuscript that discusses those different overlap metrics if you're interested.
Okay, cool.